There are many pieces of animated media that have grown in infamy over the years because of how bad they are, but they didn't have to be so bad. That's the idea behind Fixing Animation, a series where I make humble suggestions to improve what many find beyond improvement. This is Fixing Animation. After the first movie, SpongeBob SquarePants experienced a behind-the-scenes shakeup, which resulted in what many people consider an era of seasonal rot for the series, taking place between seasons 5 all the way until either season 8 or 9 depending on who you ask. A lot of people say most of the worst episodes of the series came out in seasons 5 through 7, but I would argue season 8 continued the trend of awfulness and had 3 of the worst ever episodes of SpongeBob, and among these 3 terrible episodes is one called Demolition Doofus. I cannot stand this episode. It's about SpongeBob's driving teacher trying to get him killed. If you think I'm over-exaggerating and the episode isn't really that dark, no, I'm being dead serious. No pun intended. It's not like a dark episode can't be good, but it has to be funny, or else it ends up being really off-putting. The SpongeBob Season 10 episode Out of the Picture has a similar concept and does it pretty well. What's different about Out of the Picture is that Mr. Krabs tries to get Squidward lost so that he's believed to be dead, and Mr. Krabs can't sell his paintings, which works because it's not as dark as the teacher trying to get a student killed. It's not a bad episode. Well, until Mr. Krabs starts chasing Squidward with an actual hammer. Yeah, maybe I'm not a fan of that episode. But still, it's less off-putting than Demolition Doofus. What makes this episode even worse is that it has no likable characters. Who should I even be rooting for here? Mrs. Puff definitely isn't the protagonist, but SpongeBob is so frustrating in this episode, it's hard for me to root for him when all the other characters are trying to— Look, I like SpongeBob, but I don't like this SpongeBob. Mrs. Puff gets in a boat crash at the start of the episode when SpongeBob is driving. That was so bad that now Mrs. Puff apparently won't ever be able to puff again. Mrs. Puff just went through a permanent traumatic injury, and SpongeBob laughs about it.
From now on, I guess we'll have to call you Mrs. Pop.
What the heck? Not only that, but SpongeBob says she looks better with her injury, gives Mrs. Puff a bunch of flowers she's allergic to, and when she tells him this, he lets sunlight in, making the flowers bloom, and worsening her allergies, which SpongeBob doesn't even show that he cares about. SpongeBob has this reputation among some people that think he's this obnoxious brain-dead character with no emotions, completely detached from the world around him, that causes misery for everyone around him. And episodes like this one and Boating Buddies don't help. But this isn't SpongeBob. Take it from the man himself who created SpongeBob.
SpongeBob is an adult character that acts like a child, and he has a child's perspective, and he's well-meaning, but this often causes him trouble. I would say the show is really about not losing your childlike sense in life.
SpongeBob doesn't lack empathy and brain cells. He's very childlike, but he means well and cares about the people around him. In the episode Texas, Sandy gets homesick, so SpongeBob throws her a party. Enchanted Tiki Dreams, Squidward is sad, so SpongeBob builds him an entire vacation paradise. So Demolition Doofus is a terrible portrayal of SpongeBob as a character. But the worst part about this episode is the Mrs. Puff stuff, how she comes up with an evil plan to get SpongeBob in a demolition derby for extra credit, and by extra credit she means he probably won't survive it.
I could finally be rid of SpongeBob. Forever! And I mean that in the worst possible way.
Yes, Mrs. Puff does hate being SpongeBob's driving teacher, but she's never been portrayed as such a horrible person, and was never portrayed the same way as in this episode again, at least to my knowledge. Boarding school episodes used to be a pretty big deal of the series, but they kinda died out after this episode. Sure, we still get them sometimes, here and there, but it seems like that type of episode and the character of Mrs. Puff is still recovering from Demolition Doofus. When you make an episode that handles a character as badly as this one and makes him so mean-spirited, it'll be hard for many people who watch the series to view the character the same way moving forward. Even in an episodic show like SpongeBob, there's no way of watching this episode without the implications still being there that this is an episode about a teacher trying to get revenge against a student in a very dark way. I'm gonna go on a bit of a tangent for a minute. Stick with me. You guys heard of Looney Tunes? I hope that answer is a a yes. Otherwise, that'd be very shocking. So, in Demolition Doofus, while Mrs. Puff is trying to get rid of SpongeBob, SpongeBob is completely oblivious to it, and ends up fine in the end. While I was rewatching the episode, I remember the Merry Melodies show starring Pokey Pig and Sylvester from 1954, Claws for Alarm. In the tune, Pokey Pig spends a night in a haunted hotel with Sylvester. In the show, Sylvester is Pokey's pet cat, not Granny's. While they are there, ghosts in the house keep trying to harm Pokey, who is completely unaware, while Sylvester is running back and forth protecting him from the ghosts. And it's a hilarious shot between the paranormal shenanigans and Pokey Pig being oblivious to them. In a way, this tune is similar to the SpongeBob episode Demolition Doofus, but it's a way that's mean-spirited and it's enjoyable to view because the antagonist is an actual evil entity and not a teacher who wants her student gone forever. This plot sucks because it's Mrs. Puff doing this, and it would be equally as awful if Mrs. Puff was replaced by Mr. or Mrs. SquarePants. But if it was a character that doesn't have a close, friendly relationship with SpongeBob, like Man-Ray, it might have been better. Okay, but before we get to fixing this episode, let's talk for a minute about some of the positives of it. Yes, this episode does have some good stuff in it. This episode doesn't have a lot going for it, but it has a bit more than people give it credit for. For one, the opening of SpongeBob annoying Squidward only to do something that makes Squidward say, SpongeBob! That was good stuff. It almost tricked me into thinking this was going to be a good episode. Another good thing I have to say about this episode is that its visuals aren't one of the things wrong with it. The Demolition Doofus sequence, where SpongeBob is competing against all the other drivers, is actually really cool, and the other drivers had pretty unique character designs. It was fun to see SpongeBob compete against all of them, aside from the occasional cutaway to his teacher that wants him to lose in a horrible way. And it would have been funny when Mrs. Puff yelled out to SpongeBob why is he still alive, and he thought she was giving him some advice, which he ended up using to stay alive, you know, if it wasn't Mrs. Puff. Okay, so, how are we gonna fix this episode? Well, we could replace Mrs. Puff with the Flying Dutchman, but I think I have a better idea. This is how I would go about it. The episode opens the same way the original episode did, with SpongeBob messing around with Squidward's carrots. But in this version of the episode, SpongeBob is on his way to the Krusty Krab. He's early, which is why Squidward isn't there yet. Plankton tries to steal the secret formula at the Krusty Krab, but Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob stop him, and SpongeBob jokingly says, if only driving was as easy as stopping Plankton. See where I'm going with this? That gives Plankton an idea. There's a bubble transition to the next day, and Plankton brings him to the Demolition Derby and tells him that competing against other people behind the wheel will make him a better driver. SpongeBob says, but I don't even have a license. And Plankton tells him most people in the Derby probably don't have one either. Then we have Plankton introduce SpongeBob to the guy Mrs. Puff knew in the original version of the episode, but in this version, it's Plankton who already knew him. And we also have the gag where SpongeBob is given a wheel and he somehow gets in a crash without being in a boat, because I thought that was pretty funny. There's the sequence where SpongeBob, aka the Squish, is driving around in the Demolition Derby, staying alive, as Plankton is in the background yelling at him and everyone else. Plankton decides that if you want something done right, you gotta do it yourself, and gets in a giant monster boat and chases SpongeBob, like Mrs. Puff did near the end of the original version of the episode. And Mrs. Puff shows up and yells at SpongeBob for driving without a license. And with her professional boating abilities, Mrs. Puff drives SpongeBob away from Plankton's giant boat. And the episode ends with the chum bucket getting destroyed instead of the boating school. My check will be in the mail, Nickelodeon. But what do you guys think? Let me know if you like this episode in the comments below, and if not, how would you fix it? Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like, share, and subscribe.